Blood trickled down Judge Elise Montgomery's cheek as Officer Blake stood over her hand still raised. The packed Charleston courtroom fell silent. No one had ever seen a white officer strike a black judge before. Her next words would change everything. "You just proved my point." Before we dive into this shocking story of injustice and courage, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from, hit that like button, and subscribe to hear more stories of people standing up against racism in America. Now let's see how a single slap exposed a web of corruption that reached the highest levels of power. Judge Elise Montgomery had earned every bit of respect that came with her position. At 57 years old, she'd spent 25 years presiding over the Charleston County Courthouse building, a reputation for fairness tempered with unwavering commitment to the law. The daughter of civil rights activists, Elise had graduated from Harvard Law with honors before returning to her hometown of Charleston, South Carolina, determined to change the system from within. This particular Tuesday morning seemed routine as she reviewed the day's docket in her chambers. The case before her involved a young black man named Jamal Washington, aged 22, charged with resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. The arresting officer, Sergeant Ryan Blake, was scheduled to testify. Blake's name wasn't unfamiliar to Montgomery. The 42-year-old white police sergeant had a decorated record with the department, but whispers about his conduct, particularly with black suspects, had reached her ears over the years. Nothing official had ever stuck to him, though a fact that always struck Montgomery as suspicious given the frequency of complaints. As she entered the courtroom, the usual hush fell over the gallery. Montgomery took her seat at the bench, nodding to the attorneys present. "The state versus Jamal Washington," she announced, her voice clear and authoritative. "We'll proceed with officer testimony." Sergeant Blake took the stand, cutting an imposing figure in his crisp uniform. 6'2", with close-cropped brown hair and a jaw like granite, Blake carried himself with the confidence of a man rarely questioned. The prosecutor, Assistant District Attorney Williams, led Blake through his testimony with practiced ease. According to Blake, Washington had been stopped for a broken taillight, became belligerent, then attempted to flee before turning to attack the officer. "And that's when you were forced to subdue the suspect?" Williams asked. "Yes, sir," Blake replied. "I used the minimum force necessary to protect myself and effect the arrest." When cross-examination began, defense attorney Marcus Johnson approached the stand with a tablet in hand. "Officer Blake, I have the dash cam footage from your patrol car that night. Would you care to watch it before continuing your testimony?" A flash of something crossed Blake's face before disappearing behind professional neutrality. "I stand by my report, counselor." Johnson played the video for the court. While the quality wasn't perfect, it clearly showed Washington complying with instructions, hands visible at all times. The situation escalated only when Blake roughly spun Washington around without warning. "Officer Blake," Judge Montgomery interjected, "the video evidence appears inconsistent with your testimony and written report." Blake shifted in his seat. "The angle doesn't show everything, Your Honor." Montgomery leaned forward. "It shows enough to raise serious questions about your account. Were you aware the dash cam was recording?" Blake's jaw tightened. "I have nothing to hide." Montgomery referenced the file before her. "This isn't the first time your testimony has been contradicted by evidence, Sergeant. I see 3 complaints in the past year alone." Blake's complexion darkened. "Those complaints were dismissed." "Yes," Montgomery said, "quite conveniently dismissed. I'm also noting procedural violations in this arrest. The initial stop appears questionable, and the force used seems excessive given the circumstances." Blake's hands gripped the stand railing. "With all due respect, Your Honor, you don't know what it's like out there. We make split-second decisions to protect ourselves and the public." Montgomery removed her glasses. "I understand the difficulties of law enforcement, Sergeant. What I don't understand is the pattern of discrepancies in cases involving young black men like Mr. Washington." Blake stood abruptly. "So that's what this is about. You're just another black judge playing the race card." Gasps echoed through the courtroom. Montgomery's gavel cracked sharply. "Officer Blake, you will control yourself in my courtroom or face contempt charges." But Blake was beyond hearing. Years of entitlement and barely concealed rage exploded as he strode toward the bench. "You people always stick together." Court security moved to intercept him, but Blake was faster. He reached the bench and did the unthinkable. His open palm connected with Judge Montgomery's face with a crack that silenced the room. Time seemed to stop as a trickle of blood appeared where Blake's ring had cut her cheek. The courtroom erupted. Bailiffs tackled Blake to the ground as he continued shouting racial slurs. Attorneys shouted for order. Spectators pushed toward the exits or pressed forward for a better view. Through it all, Judge Montgomery remained seated, one hand to her bleeding cheek, her expression a mask of dignified shock. When she finally spoke, her voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Restrain Officer Blake. He is remanded into custody on charges of contempt of court and assaulting a judicial officer." She turned to her clerk. "Contact the district attorney's office immediately." A bailiff offered Montgomery a handkerchief for her bleeding cheek. She accepted it with a nod before addressing the stunned courtroom. "This court declares a mistrial in the case of Jamal Washington due to officer misconduct. Mr. Washington, you are released pending further investigation." As Blake was dragged away in handcuffs, still hurling obscenities, news cameras captured every moment. Montgomery knew the footage would be playing on every channel within the hour. She maintained her composure until the courtroom was cleared, refusing the court officer's suggestion to seek medical attention. "This court has business to complete," she said firmly. Only when she finally returned to her chambers did her hands begin to shake, the full impact of what had just occurred washing over her. An officer had struck her a sitting judge in open court. The assault was bad enough, but the racial animus behind it was unmistakable. Montgomery knew this incident would force a conversation many in Charleston had been avoiding for decades. As she cleaned the cut on her cheek, she made a silent promise to herself this time justice would be served no matter how high up the corruption went. Hours after the incident, Judge Montgomery sat alone in her chambers, the afternoon sun casting long shadows across her desk. The courtroom had been cleared, statements taken, and Blake processed into the county jail, but the reality of what had transpired still hadn't fully registered. She touched the butterfly bandage on her cheek, wincing slightly. The physical pain was minimal compared to the emotional wound inflicted. In 25 years on the bench, she had faced disrespect, thinly veiled racism, and occasional threats, but never such a blatant physical attack. The incident had triggered memories she'd spent years compartmentalizing. The time at Harvard when a professor suggested she might be more comfortable at Howard. The whispers when she became the first black female judge in Charleston County. The anonymous note left on her windshield after she ruled against a prominent white developer. Know your place. A knock interrupted her thoughts. District Attorney Marcus Washington entered without waiting for a response. At 55, Washington was a political animal, always calculating the angles. Though also black, he had built his career by never rocking the boat too vigorously. Elise, he began using her first name, despite their professional setting. "This is unprecedented. How are you holding up?" Montgomery straightened. "I'm fine, Marcus. Blake has been processed." Washington nodded, taking a seat without invitation. "That's partly why I'm here. This situation is sensitive. The police union is already making noise." Montgomery's expression hardened. An officer assaulted a judge in open court while using racial slurs. What exactly is sensitive about that? Washington leaned forward. "You know how this works. The news is calling it a racially motivated attack. The police are saying Blake was provoked that you showed bias against him in court. I questioned inconsistencies in his testimony, Marcus. That's my job." "Of course," Washington said, his tone conciliatory. "But there's an opportunity here to handle this quietly. Blake offers a public apology, takes sensitivity training, maybe a suspension without pay." Montgomery stared at him in disbelief. "Are you suggesting we sweep this under the rug?" A white officer struck a black judge while calling her racial slurs, and you want to offer him sensitivity training. Before Washington could respond, Montgomery's phone buzzed. A text from her daughter, Zora. "Just saw the news. Coming over. Don't talk to anyone until I get there." Zora Montgomery, 32, had followed a different path than her mother. Instead of working within the system, she had become a prominent civil rights activist, organizing protests against police brutality and systemic racism. Montgomery felt a surge of gratitude for her daughter's protective instinct. "Marcus," she said firmly, "I appreciate your concern, but I will be pursuing maximum charges against Officer Blake. This isn't just about me. It's about every black person who has faced abuse of power and been told to handle it quietly." Washington sighed. "The police chief called me personally. They're worried about department morale, community relations. I'm more concerned about justice than police morale," Montgomery replied. "Blake committed a crime on camera in front of dozens of witnesses. He will be prosecuted like any other criminal." After Washington left, looking troubled, Montgomery checked her phone. The incident had already gone viral. The police union had released a statement defending Blake, claiming Montgomery had demonstrated clear anti-police bias and had provoked the unfortunate reaction. Social media was divided with hashtags #defend. Judge Montgomery and #Blake was framed trending simultaneously. A knock at the door announced Police Chief Thomas Carter. Unlike Washington, Carter waited to be invited in. "Judge Montgomery," he began formally, "I wanted to personally express my regrets for what happened today." Montgomery nodded, noting he had expressed regret, not an apology. "Thank you, Chief Carter. I trust your department will cooperate fully with the investigation." Carter cleared his throat. "About that, I'm concerned about how this incident is being characterized. Officer Blake has an exemplary record." "With numerous complaints that were mysteriously dismissed," Montgomery interrupted. Carter's expression tightened. "Complaints aren't convictions, Judge. I'd hate to see this become a racial issue that divides our community." Montgomery met his gaze steadily. "Chief Carter, when an officer calls a judge a racial slur while assaulting her, it already is a racial issue." When she finally arrived home that evening, Montgomery found 3 threatening messages on her answering machine. One male voice warned, "You push this and you'll regret it. Some people need to learn their place." She deleted them and poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon, her father's drink. She thought of him now, remembering how he'd come home bloodied from a protest in '68, beaten by police for demanding equal rights. "Nothing changes if we stay silent," he'd told her that night. Her contemplation was interrupted by her phone ringing. To her surprise, it was Supreme Court Justice Patricia Reynolds, one of the few black women serving on the state's highest court. "Elise," Justice Reynolds said without preamble, "I saw the news. Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Patricia. Shaken but unharmed." "Good, because you need to be prepared. They're going to come after you with everything they have. This isn't just about one officer losing his temper. This is about power, and they won't relinquish it without a fight." Montgomery sipped her bourbon. "I know. The DA already suggested handling it quietly." "Of course he did," Reynolds said with disgust. "Listen to me, Elise. You have support. Many of us have been waiting for someone to finally expose what's happening in Charleston's justice system." After they hung up, Montgomery contemplated Reynolds's words. The incident was bigger than Blake's individual racism. It was a window into systemic corruption that had persisted for decades. A text from Zora announced her arrival, and moments later, Montgomery was embracing her daughter. "Mom, this is outrageous," Zora said, examining the cut on her mother's cheek. "We're organizing a protest for tomorrow. The community needs to show support." "Zora," Montgomery cautioned, "I'm still a sitting judge. I can't be associated with protests related to a case that might come before me." Zora's expression was determined. "Then let me fight for you. Someone has to." Later that evening, an unexpected visitor arrived. Retired Judge Harold Wilson, 80 years old, and one of the first black judges in South Carolina. Montgomery welcomed him into her living room with respect. "Judge Wilson, this is an unexpected honor." Wilson lowered himself carefully into an armchair. "I came as soon as I heard. What happened to you today?" It brought back memories. His gnarled hands trembled slightly. 1973, I ruled against a white police officer in a brutality case. The next day he confronted me in the parking garage. No cameras back then, no witnesses. He broke 2 of my ribs. Montgomery stared at him in shock. "I never knew." "Nobody did," Wilson said. "The department covered it up, threatened my family if I spoke out. I took a leave of absence. And when I came back, I never ruled against the police again." Tears glistened in the old man's eyes. "I've lived with that shame for 50 years. Don't make my mistake, Elise. Fight them, no matter what." After Wilson left, Montgomery sat in her darkened living room, his story weighing heavily on her mind. She thought of all the judges who had been silenced, all the victims who had been denied justice, all the corrupt officers who had escaped accountability. By striking her, Blake had unwittingly exposed a system of oppression that had operated in the shadows for generations. As midnight approached, Montgomery made her decision. She would not be silenced. She would not be intimidated. She would use every power at her disposal to expose not just Blake's racism, but the entire corrupt system that had protected him and others like him. The fight would be dangerous, potentially career-ending, but she owed it to Judge Wilson, to her father, to Jamal Washington, and to every Black American who had been denied justice. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. 1 week after the assault, Montgomery slipped quietly into the back row of Courtroom B for Officer Blake's bail hearing. She wore civilian clothes and dark sunglasses, hoping to observe without being recognized. Judge William Preston presided, a 65-year-old white man known for his conservative rulings. Blake sat at the defense table beside his attorney, James Whitfield, the go-to lawyer for police officers in trouble. Tall and impeccably dressed in a $1,000 suit, Whitfield had built a career defending officers accused of misconduct with an alarming success rate. The proceedings began with Whitfield arguing passionately that Blake posed no flight risk, had deep community ties, and deserved release on his own recognizance. "My client has served this community with distinction for 15 years. Whitfield declared. This unfortunate incident was an aberration provoked by what he perceived as judicial bias. The prosecutor, a young assistant district attorney named Michael Collins, seemed oddly subdued in his counterarguments. While the state acknowledges the seriousness of assaulting a judge, we recognize Officer Blake's service record and lack of prior criminal history. Montgomery tensed. The prosecutor was barely putting up a fight. Judge Preston nodded thoughtfully before delivering his ruling. Blake would be released on $10,000 bail with no restrictions on movement and no surrender of his personal firearms. The only condition was that he stay away from Judge Montgomery. The decision sent a murmur through the courtroom. For assaulting a judge, a felony that could carry up to 20 years in prison, Blake had received bail conditions more appropriate for a misdemeanor. As the courtroom emptied, Montgomery remained seated, processing what she'd witnessed. The fix was clearly in. A woman slid into the seat beside her. "Judge Montgomery, I'm Detective Shanice Williams, Internal Affairs." Williams was 38, with an athletic build and alert eyes that missed nothing. "Could we speak privately?" Minutes later, they sat in Montgomery's car in the parking garage. "I've been assigned to investigate Blake," Williams explained, "but I'm already hitting roadblocks. Files missing witnesses, suddenly uncooperative." She hesitated. "There's something you should know. Blake isn't just a bad apple. He's part of a group called the Enforcers within the department." Montgomery frowned. "What kind of group?" "Unofficial. Maybe 12 officers who share a certain perspective. They target Black neighborhoods, manipulate evidence, and protect each other. Blake's one of their leaders." Williams handed Montgomery a thumb drive. Dashcam footage that mysteriously vanished from evidence. Blake beating a black teenager who was already handcuffed. The department buried it. Montgomery stared at the small drive. "Why are you giving me this? It could end your career." Williams' expression hardened. "My brother was arrested by Blake 3 years ago. Planted evidence. He's still serving time for a crime he didn't commit. Not everyone in the department supports what these officers are doing." That evening, Montgomery returned home to find her garage door spray painted with a racial slur. As she photographed the vandalism, her phone rang. An unknown number. "Judge Montgomery. This is Taylor Jenkins from the Atlanta Tribune. I'm investigating police corruption in Charleston. I think we should talk." Montgomery agreed to meet Jenkins the following day at a quiet cafe outside the city. The journalist was younger than Montgomery expected, barely 30, but her eyes held the sharp intelligence of someone who had seen too much. "I've been tracking Blake and his associates for 18 months, Jenkins explained, spreading files across the table. "The pattern is clear. Black suspects arrested by these officers are 3 times more likely to be injured during arrest, and their cases are twice as likely to be based on evidence that doesn't hold up in court." "Why hasn't this been published?" Montgomery asked. Jenkins' expression darkened. "Every time I get close, management kills the story. Our owner plays golf with the police commissioner and several judges. Last time they claimed insufficient evidence. The time before that concern about damaging police-community relations." Through her daughter, Zora Montgomery was introduced to the Truth and Justice Coalition, a community group documenting police abuses. They met in the basement of a church in the historically black East Side neighborhood. As coalition members shared stories about Blake and his fellow officers, a pattern emerged of targeted harassment, excessive force, and falsified reports. The meeting was interrupted when a member noticed an unmarked police car circling the block. "They're watching us," Zora whispered to her mother. "They always do." Later that night, Montgomery discovered her judicial email had been hacked when several colleagues mentioned receiving strange messages from her account. The invasion of privacy was meant to intimidate her, but it had the opposite effect. It confirmed what she was beginning to suspect: this case was much bigger than one officer's racist outburst. It involved systemic corruption throughout Charleston's justice system. Montgomery called Detective Williams. "I think we need to create our own investigation team," she said. "Official channels are compromised." Williams agreed. "I can work from inside, but carefully. They're already watching me." Montgomery then contacted Jenkins and arranged to bring her into their confidence. Zora would be their liaison to the community coalition. Together, they would build a case too strong to be buried or dismissed. If you believe Judge Montgomery is right to investigate despite the risks, comment number 1 below. If you think she should prioritize her safety and career by handling this through official channels only, comment number 2. What would you do if you witnessed corruption but knew powerful people wanted to keep it hidden? Like this video. If you believe the justice system should work the same for everyone, regardless of race, and subscribe to follow Judge Montgomery's dangerous journey for justice. But here's the question that haunts me. If the people meant to uphold justice are corrupt, where can someone like Judge Montgomery turn for help? Let's see how deep this conspiracy really goes. Montgomery received official notice of temporary recusal the following morning. The Judicial Review Board cited potential conflict of interest and need for emotional recovery as justifications for removing her from the bench pending investigation. The letter was signed by Chief Justice Robert Harding, a man who had never shown particular concern for Montgomery's well-being before. Though the recusal was technically standard procedure, the timing felt strategic, removing her official authority just as she began investigating. Freed from courtroom duties, Montgomery converted her home office into an investigation headquarters. The team established secure communication protocols using encrypted messaging and burner phones. Their first priority was collecting testimonies from those who had encountered Blake and his associates. Detective Williams compiled arrest records showing a disturbing pattern when Blake arrested white citizens' injuries occurred in approximately 7% of cases. For black citizens, that number jumped to 28%, 4 times higher. Jenkins obtained body camera footage from 3 of Blake's arrests, each showing excessive force against compliant black suspects. The Community Coalition provided 12 sworn statements from victims of Blake's brutality, many too frightened to report officially. Montgomery analyzed court outcomes for cases involving the enforcers and discovered another pattern: cases with questionable evidence were consistently assigned to the same 3 judges, all of whom ruled overwhelmingly in favor of police testimony despite contradictory evidence. "It's not random assignment," Montgomery explained to the team gathered in her living room. "Someone's manipulating the system to ensure these cases go to friendly judges." Jenkins nodded. "I found something interesting about Judge Preston, who handled Blake's bail hearing. Last year, he received a cabin on Lake Marion as a gift from his old college friend, Michael Rankin. Rankin happens to be the police union president." Williams whistled. "That should be enough for an ethics investigation." "In a functioning system, yes," Montgomery agreed. "But we need to assume the entire structure is compromised." As the investigation progressed, Montgomery faced increasing isolation from her judicial colleagues. Invitations to social functions ceased. Former friends made excuses to avoid lunch meetings. In the courthouse, conversations stopped when she entered rooms. The message was clear: she had become radioactive. Returning to her car after meeting with Jenkins, Montgomery found a note under her windshield wiper: "Judges should stay in their lane. Final warning." That evening, Williams brought disturbing news. Blake had been involved in 3 shootings of unarmed black men over his career, all ruled justified with minimal investigation. More concerning, Williams had discovered an internal memo directing supervisors to route complaints against Blake and certain other officers through Lieutenant James Collins, who systematically buried them. Collins calls it managing department morale, Williams explained. "He's the gatekeeper protecting the enforcers." Montgomery's brother Calvin arrived from Virginia the next day. A retired Marine Corps colonel, Calvin insisted on staying with his sister after hearing about the threats. "This isn't my first combat zone," he said, installing additional security cameras around Montgomery's house. "And you always were too stubborn to back down from a fight." His presence proved fortunate when Jenkins uncovered the most significant lead, yet financial connections between Blake and wealthy real estate developer Richard Garrison. Bank records showed monthly payments from one of Garrison's shell companies to Blake, labeled as security consultation. Garrison's development company had been buying property in historically black neighborhoods at below-market rates, often from owners who had been arrested by Blake or his associates. "It's not just racism," Jenkins explained, spreading documents across Montgomery's dining table. "It's gentrification through intimidation. They're using arrests and harassment to force black families out, then swooping in to buy the properties cheap." The team was discussing this revelation when Calvin, monitoring the security cameras, noticed 2 unmarked cars parked at both ends of the street. "We've got company," he warned. Moments later, Williams's phone buzzed with a text from her partner in Internal Affairs. "Your investigation file was just accessed by the commissioner. Get out." They barely escaped through the back door before 4 men approached the house. Calvin's military training proved invaluable as he led them through neighboring yards to a prearranged, safe location. "They know what we're doing," Montgomery said once they were secure. "Someone's feeding them information." Jenkins looked grim. "We need to consider the possibility of a leak in our group." Montgomery nodded. "From now on, we compartmentalize information. No one gets the full picture except me." That night, in the spare bedroom of a coalition member's home, Montgomery reviewed everything they'd learned. The corruption extended beyond the police department into the judicial system, the district attorney's office, and city government. Property records, court assignments, dismissed complaints, suspicious financial transactions all pointed to a coordinated effort to maintain power and wealth by exploiting and controlling black communities. As she connected the final dots, Montgomery realized that what had begun with Blake's assault had uncovered something far more insidious, a modern version of the systemic oppression her parents had fought against, now disguised behind badges, gavels, and real estate developments. The challenge ahead would be proving it in a system designed to protect itself. She would need to find allies in unexpected places, gather evidence that couldn't be dismissed, and prepare for the inevitable betrayal from someone she trusted. But first, she needed to identify the head of the snake, someone with enough power and influence to orchestrate such widespread corruption, someone who would stop at nothing to maintain control, and someone who now saw Judge Elise Montgomery as their most dangerous enemy. 2 weeks after the incident that had upended her life, Montgomery sat in the gallery of Courtroom A for Blake's formal arraignment. The case had attracted national attention, with media trucks lining the street outside and demonstrators on both sides facing off on the courthouse steps. Inside, the tension was palpable as Blake entered in a tailored suit rather than his uniform, Whitfield at his side. Montgomery noted how different he appeared from the typical defendants in this courtroom, most of whom couldn't afford designer suits or high-priced attorneys. Before proceedings began, a stir moved through the courtroom as Mayor Angela Davis made a surprise appearance, taking a seat directly behind Montgomery. Davis, the first black woman to serve as Charleston's mayor, leaned forward to whisper, "I wanted you to know you have support at the highest levels of city government." Montgomery nodded gratefully, though experience had taught her to be wary of political gestures that might change with the wind. Judge Walter Freeman entered and called the court to order. At 70, Freeman had been Montgomery's mentor when she first joined the bench. She had always respected his commitment to fairness and procedure, which made what followed all the more disturbing. As Whitfield presented motions to dismiss key evidence, including the courtroom video of the assault, Freeman nodded thoughtfully. "The court recognizes the sensitive nature of recordings made within the courthouse," he stated. "We must consider both privacy concerns and the potential prejudicial impact of such evidence." Montgomery stiffened. The video was irrefutable evidence of Blake's crime witnessed by dozens. There was no legal basis for excluding it. When the prosecutor offered only token opposition to Whitfield's motions, Freeman granted most of them, effectively gutting the state's case. By the hearing's end, the charges had been reduced from felony assault on a judicial officer to simple assault and disorderly conduct, both misdemeanors. Blake's expression remained neutral, but the slight curl of his lip betrayed his satisfaction. After court adjourned, Montgomery waited until Freeman's chambers were clear of staff before knocking on his door. "Walter, so?" she said, closing the door behind her. "What happened in there? You gutted the case." Freeman avoided her eyes, arranging papers on his desk. "I followed the law, Elise. The motions had merit." "That's not true, and you know it." Montgomery moved closer. "The courtroom video is admissible under any reasonable interpretation. You've admitted similar evidence dozens of times." Freeman finally met her gaze, his expression resigned. "Some cases are different. Because the defendant is a police officer, or because he's white." Freeman sighed heavily. "Because there are powerful people involved who don't want this case to proceed, people who can make things very difficult for those who oppose them." Montgomery stared at her mentor in disbelief. "Are you telling me you're being pressured to throw this case?" "I'm telling you to be careful, Elise. These people, they have reach you can't imagine. They've been running things in this city for generations." "Who, Walter? Give me names." Freeman shook his head. "I've already said too much. My grandchildren." He left the implication hanging. "They threatened your family." Freeman didn't answer directly. "Just drop this, Elise. Blake will get a slap on the wrist, and everyone can move on. Push harder, and people get hurt." Montgomery left Freeman's chambers with a heavy heart, but strengthened resolve. That her own mentor had been compromised showed the depth of the corruption they faced. Later that day, another blow came when Detective Williams called with news that her captain had reassigned her, citing a personnel complaint. "What's up?" Someone leaked details of our investigation. Williams said, her voice tight with anger. My entire case file on Blake was copied and sent to Internal Affairs, accusing me of conducting an unauthorized investigation with political motives. The pressure continued mounting. Jenkins reported that her editor had pulled her from the police corruption story after several major advertisers threatened to withdraw their business from the paper. Most frightening was the call Montgomery received from the hospital. Her daughter Zora had been attacked by unknown assailants while leaving a coalition meeting. Though not critically injured, Zora had suffered a concussion and broken wrist. At the hospital, Montgomery held her daughter's hand, rage and fear warring within her. "This is because of me," she whispered. Zora shook her head. "This is because of them, Mom, because they're scared of what we've uncovered. I never should have involved you." "I involved myself," Zora said firmly, "and I'm not backing down. Neither should you." The next morning, Assistant District Attorney Leon Parker, who had privately offered support to Montgomery's investigation, announced his transfer to the Environmental Crimes Division, effectively removing him from any cases involving police. When Montgomery called him, Parker sounded defeated. "I'm sorry, Judge. They know I've been helping you. The DA gave me a choice transfer or a termination. I have 3 kids into college." The pattern was clear. Anyone associated with Montgomery or the investigation was being systematically neutralized. But the most devastating betrayal was yet to come. Montgomery had begun to suspect information was leaking from within their core group. To confirm her suspicions, she crafted different versions of their next investigative steps and shared them separately with each team member. When Blake's attorney filed a motion specifically countering the strategy she had shared with community activist Marcus Thompson, her heart sank. Thompson had been a trusted ally, a lifelong advocate for police accountability. At their next meeting, held in the back room of a restaurant owned by a coalition member, Montgomery confronted him. "You're feeding information to Whitfield," she said quietly. Thompson's expression flickered before settling into indignation. "That's absurd. I've fought against police corruption for 20 years. Then explain how Blake's team knew exactly what we planned to do next. Details only you had." The others watched in stunned silence as Thompson's facade crumbled. "You don't understand the pressure they put on people like me," he finally said. "They found tax irregularities in my nonprofit. Said they'd overlook them if I helped manage the situation. By spying on us." Thompson looked away. "I only told them some things, enough to protect myself." Calvin, who had been standing by the door, moved forward menacingly. "People are getting hurt because of your betrayal. My niece is in the hospital." Montgomery raised a hand to stop her brother. "How long have you been reporting to them? And who is them, exactly?" 6 months, and I don't know who's at the top. I report to a detective named Harris. He passes information up the chain." Williams cursed. "Harris works directly for the commissioner." After Thompson left in disgrace, the remaining team members returned to Montgomery's home to regroup, only to find it had been broken into. Her home office was destroyed, files missing, computer stolen. The investigation board she had carefully constructed was gone. The message was clear: they were always one step ahead. As Montgomery surveyed the damage, her phone rang. An unknown number. "Judge Montgomery," a digitally altered voice said, "this is your final warning. The next time it won't be just your office or your daughter. It will be you." Calvin put a protective arm around his sister. "We need to get you somewhere safe." Montgomery nodded, but her expression remained determined. "They think this will make me back down, but all it's done is confirm we're getting close to something they desperately want to hide." That night, as they relocated to a hotel under false names, Montgomery knew they had reached a turning point. Their small team had been infiltrated, their evidence stolen, their supporters intimidated. The corruption was even more extensive than she had imagined, reaching into every corner of Charleston's power structure. To continue fighting, they would need help from outside the system, someone beyond the reach of local influence. As Calvin stood watch at the hotel room window, Montgomery made a call to a former law school classmate who now worked for the FBI. It was time to escalate this battle beyond Charleston's borders. The meeting with FBI agent Dominic Torres took place at a rest stop 30 miles outside Charleston. Torres, a veteran agent with salt and pepper hair and the watchful eyes of someone who had seen the worst of humanity, listened intently as Montgomery outlined their findings. "We've been investigating corruption in several South Carolina police departments," Torres confirmed when she finished. "Charleston has been on our radar, but we've struggled to develop sources within the department." He tapped the file Montgomery had provided. "This could be the break we've needed." Torres explained that the FBI had identified links between police corruption and drug trafficking operations across the state. "We believe certain officers are seizing drugs only to put them back on the street through dealers they control. It creates a cycle arrest, some dealers to make their stats look good, protect others to profit from the trade." The connection to Garrison's real estate developments added a new dimension. "They're using targeted arrests and harassment to drive down property values in specific neighborhoods," Montgomery explained. "Then Garrison swoops in to buy at rock-bottom prices before gentrifying and selling high." Torres nodded. "Classic racketeering. The question is how high this goes and who's protecting them." The alliance with the FBI provided Montgomery's team with resources they desperately needed: secure communications, surveillance equipment, and most importantly, federal authority beyond the reach of local corruption. Williams, still technically on duty, though reassigned to desk work, became their primary source within the department. She discovered that judicial assignments for police misconduct cases weren't random, but manipulated by Court Administrator Gerald Phillips, who ensured sensitive cases went to cooperative judges. The investigation took a darker turn when Judge Walter Freeman was found dead in his home, an apparent suicide. A note claimed responsibility for failures of character and judgment and admitted to participating in a corrupt system. Montgomery immediately doubted the suicide story. Walter was troubled by what was happening, but he wasn't suicidal, and the note reads like it was written by committee. Her suspicions grew when Jenkins uncovered photos of Freeman with Garrison at an exclusive hunting club 2 weeks earlier. The men appeared to be arguing. Meanwhile, Williams had been quietly investigating Blake's finances and discovered unexplained deposits totaling over $400,000 in offshore accounts. "No police sergeant legitimately earns this kind of money, she reported. Jenkins, now working freelance after being fired from the Tribune, followed the money trail between Garrison's companies and various city officials. She found that the mayor's brother-in-law had received consulting contracts worth millions from Garrison's development company, despite having no relevant experience. Montgomery's brother Calvin, using his military connections, confirmed they were being followed by unmarked vehicles whenever they left their temporary base of operations. "Professional surveillance," he noted. "Not just cops. These are trained operatives." The picture emerging was more disturbing than anything Montgomery had imagined, a conspiracy reaching the highest levels of city government, the courts and law enforcement all working together to maintain control over Charleston's development, drug trade, and justice system. At the center stood Garrison, but even he answered to someone else, someone whose identity remained hidden. The breakthrough came when Williams discovered a schedule for a meeting at Garrison's estate outside the city. Every month the same cars arrive, the police commissioner, Garrison Judge Preston, and someone in a car with federal government plates. Torres provided sophisticated surveillance equipment, and the team set up in the woods bordering Garrison's property. Montgomery insisted on being present despite the danger. "I need to see this with my own eyes." Through high-powered microphones and cameras, they observed and recorded as the attendees arrived Police Commissioner Warren Shaw, Richard Garrison, Judge Preston, and finally a silver town car with government plates. Montgomery gasped as she recognized the final attendee, Chief Justice Harold Roberts of the State Supreme Court. "My God," she whispered. It goes all the way to the top of the judicial system. The group's conversation, captured by the FBI's equipment, confirmed their worst fears. They discussed which judges would handle upcoming cases, which properties would be targeted next for urban renewal, and how to ensure Blake's case resulted in minimal consequences. "Montgomery is becoming a serious problem," Roberts said, his distinguished voice unmistakable. "Her investigation is getting uncomfortably close to matters that can't become public." Commissioner Shaw nodded. "We may need to consider more permanent solutions. My contacts could make it look like a robbery gone wrong." The team had heard enough to build a RICO case, but as they prepared to withdraw, Calvin spotted security personnel moving in their direction. "They've found us," he hissed. "Move now." They retreated through the woods to their vehicles, but halfway to the main road, headlights appeared behind them. "They're following," Jenkins called out from the back seat. Calvin accelerated, his military training evident in his evasive driving. But on a curve in the rural road, an SUV rammed them from the side. Their car spun out of control, rolling down an embankment before crashing into a tree. Montgomery regained consciousness to the sound of Calvin shouting her name and the smell of gasoline. Her brother pulled her from the wreckage moments before flames engulfed the vehicle. Williams had been thrown clear, but was unconscious with a head wound. Jenkins was helping Calvin move Williams away from the burning car when headlights illuminated them. Two men approached with guns drawn. Calvin pushed Montgomery into the underbrush. "Run!" he commanded before turning to face the attackers. Shots rang out as Montgomery stumbled through the dark woods, the thumb drive with their evidence clutched in her hand. Hours later, a battered Montgomery. Bourret was admitted to Charleston Memorial Hospital under a false name arranged by Torres. Calvin had managed to fight off the attackers and escape with Williams and Jenkins, though all were injured. The FBI had secured the hospital room, but their protection was limited by jurisdiction and manpower. As Montgomery drifted in and out of consciousness, news reports described the incident as a drunk driving accident, claiming she had been intoxicated behind the wheel. It was character assassination, preparing the public to disbelieve anything she might reveal. When she finally stabilized, Torres brought devastating news: a judge had ruled their surveillance evidence inadmissible, claiming it had been obtained without proper warrants, despite Torres's assurances they had followed protocol. "Someone got to the federal judge," Torres said grimly. "This goes even higher than we thought." Further complicating matters, the state attorney general announced he was personally taking over Blake's case, citing community interest in a fair and impartial proceeding. It was another move to ensure the case would be controlled. Montgomery realized they had reached a critical juncture. The system they had hoped to use against the conspirators was itself compromised at every level. Conventional legal channels would never deliver justice. With Blake's trial approaching, controlled by corrupt officials and based on deliberately weakened evidence, Montgomery knew they needed a new strategy. Something so public, so undeniable, that even the most powerful conspirators couldn't suppress it. Against medical advice, she checked herself out of the hospital. "They tried to kill us because they're afraid of what we know," she told her battered but determined team. "Now we need to make their worst fears come true. Do you think Judge Montgomery should go public with everything they've discovered, even without court-admissible evidence?" Comment number 1. If you believe the truth must come out no matter the consequences. Comment number 2, if you think she should work with the FBI to build a stronger case first. Would you risk your life to expose corruption, or would you protect yourself and your loved ones by staying silent? Like this video if you believe ordinary people can stand up to powerful systems and win. Subscribe to see how this dangerous game of cat and mouse concludes. But I have to ask, when corruption reaches the highest levels of government justice and law enforcement, is there anywhere left to turn for help? Watch as Judge Montgomery prepares for her most dangerous move yet. 3 months had passed since Officer Blake's palm had struck Judge Montgomery's cheek, changing both their lives and setting in motion a chain of events that would shake Charleston to its core. Blake's trial was scheduled to begin in Courtroom C, the largest in the courthouse to accommodate media and spectators. The case had been assigned to Judge Richard Fleming, a close associate of Chief Justice Roberts and a frequent hunting companion of Richard Garrison. Montgomery, still recovering from the car crash with a lingering limp and occasional headaches, had worked tirelessly with her team to prepare for this moment. Their conventional evidence had been systematically excluded or undermined, but Montgomery had developed an alternative strategy. "We can't beat them in their rigged game," she had explained to Torres, Williams, Jenkins, and Calvin during a strategy session in their new safe house. "So we'll change the game entirely." On the morning of the trial, security around the courthouse was unprecedented. Police barricades separated pro-Blake supporters, mostly off-duty officers and their families, from the larger crowd demanding justice for Montgomery. National media crews broadcast live from the courthouse steps. Inside the courtroom filled to capacity. Blake sat at the defense table looking confident, almost smug, in an expensive suit. Whitfield arranged papers beside him, occasionally leaning over to whisper something that made Blake smile. The prosecution table was manned by a team led personally by Attorney General Raymond Phillips, ostensibly to show the state's commitment to justice. In reality, Phillips had built a deliberately flawed case that would justify an acquittal or minimal sentence. A murmur swept through the courtroom as Montgomery entered, leaning slightly on a cane. She had not been expected to attend. Blake's expression flickered momentarily before settling back into practiced neutrality. Montgomery took a seat in the second row, directly in Blake's line of sight. Judge Fleming entered and called the court to order. The proceedings began with opening statements. Whitfield painted Blake as a dedicated officer momentarily overwhelmed by stress and provocation. Phillips offered a perfunctory counter-argument, emphasizing Blake's otherwise exemplary record and suggesting temporary diminished capacity, as the prosecution began presenting its case carefully, avoiding the most damaging evidence. Montgomery's legal team filed into the courtroom and took seats behind her. Attorney Sarah Chen approached the prosecutor's table and handed Phillips a document. "What is this?" Phillips demanded, scanning the paper. "Motion to introduce new evidence and add a witness, Your Honor," Chen announced, addressing the court. "On behalf of Judge Montgomery, who is exercising her rights as the victim in this case." Fleming frowned. "This is highly irregular, Counselor. The discovery period has closed." "This witness only came forward yesterday, Your Honor, making this admissible under Rule 60, Section B of the South Carolina Rules of Criminal Procedure." Fleming couldn't deny the procedural rule without revealing his bias. "The court will review this motion during the lunch recess. Proceed with the current witness." By the lunch break, word had spread through the courthouse about the mysterious new witness. When proceedings resumed, Fleming reluctantly granted the motion, though his expression suggested he expected the testimony to be inconsequential. "The prosecution may call its additional witness," he announced. Phillips, clearly blindsided by this development that his own team hadn't anticipated, called out, "The state calls Officer Thomas Reynolds." A ripple of surprise moved through the courtroom as a uniformed police officer entered. Blake straightened in his chair, eyes widening in what appeared to be recognition and alarm. Reynolds, 45 and visibly nervous, took the stand and was sworn in. "Officer Reynolds," Phillips began uncertainly, "what is your relationship to the defendant?" "I was his partner for 7 years, sir, from 2015 to 2022. "And why are you testifying today?" Reynolds glanced at Blake before answering. "Because I can no longer stay silent about what I witnessed during those years." What followed was devastating testimony. Reynolds described Blake's long history of racist comments and excessive force against black citizens. He recounted how Blake would routinely plant evidence, falsify reports, and intimidate witnesses. Most damning was Reynolds's account of the days leading up to the courtroom assault. Blake told me he was going to put that black bitch in her place. Those were his exact words. He said Judge Montgomery had been interfering with the arrangement for too long, and her questioning him in open court was the perfect opportunity to send a message. Whitfield was on his feet immediately. "Objection hearsay. Your Honor." Chen interjected, "Statements indicating prior intent to commit a crime fall under the state of mind exception to the hearsay rule." Fleming, trapped by proper procedure with journalists watching, overruled the objection. Reynolds continued describing how Blake had boasted afterward that people downtown would ensure he faced minimal consequences. Whitfield's cross-examination was aggressive, attempting to portray Reynolds as a disgruntled employee with a vendetta. "Isn't it true you were passed over for promotion 3 times while partnered with Sergeant Blake?" "Yes, sir." "And you blame him for that, don't you?" "Us." Reynolds shook his head. "I blame myself for staying silent about what we were doing. The promotions went to other members of the enforcers who played along with the corruption." Whitfield pounced. "What evidence do you have of this alleged corrupt group?" Reynolds reached into his pocket and produced a small digital recorder. "Blake gave me this when we were partners. Said to record any encounters that might be problematic so we could get our story straight. I kept it after we were reassigned. It has recordings of Blake discussing the assault on Judge Montgomery, both before and after it happened." The courtroom erupted. Fleming pounded his gavel while Whitfield shouted objections. Blake lunged toward Reynolds, requiring 3 bailiffs to restrain him. As order was gradually restored, Fleming had no choice but to admit the recordings into evidence, though he immediately called a recess to review them privately. During the recess, Jenkins activated the second phase of their plan. Despite the judge's orders prohibiting electronic devices, she had smuggled in a specially designed transmitter that was now streaming Reynolds's testimony and would broadcast the audio recordings once played in court. Outside, thousands watched on hastily erected screens set up by Montgomery's supporters. When court resumed, the tension was palpable. Fleming, his face ashen after hearing the recordings, announced, "In light of this new evidence, this court will allow the recordings to be played." The audio was damning, Blake's voice unmistakable. "Roberts and Garrison want Montgomery neutralized. Too many questions about the wrong cases. I'll handle it when I testify next week. Make it look like she provoked me." Another recording dated after the assault. "Don't worry about the charges. Phillips will take over the case personally. They're already working on the judge assignment. This all goes away in a few months, and Montgomery's reputation will be destroyed in the process." As the recordings played, Blake's composure finally shattered. He shouted at Reynolds, calling him a traitor and threatening revenge. The outburst only reinforced the portrait painted by the evidence. During the commotion, Attorney General Phillips slipped from the courtroom, phone in hand. Montgomery watched him go, knowing he was contacting his handlers for instructions. By day's end, the landscape had shifted dramatically. National media was broadcasting portions of the recordings, making it impossible to suppress the evidence. Protesters outside the courthouse had swelled into the thousands. The FBI, led by Torres, used the public revelations as justification to execute search warrants on previously untouchable targets. Montgomery's team had successfully forced the conspiracy into the open, where backroom deals and quiet intimidation held less power. As she left the courthouse under her brother's protective escort, Montgomery caught sight of Blake being led to a secure transport vehicle in handcuffs. Their eyes met briefly across the plaza. In that moment, she saw something she hadn't expected: fear. The man who had struck her with such arrogant impunity now understood that his protectors might sacrifice him to save themselves. The confrontation had been won, but Montgomery knew the war was far from over. The system would fight back with everything it had. Powerful people would not surrender their privilege and protection without deploying every weapon in their considerable arsenal. That night, as her team celebrated their courtroom victory, Montgomery slipped away to her temporary bedroom. She opened her laptop to find an encrypted message from Torres. Multiple high-profile arrests in progress. Stay secure. Garrison found dead in home. Apparent suicide but investigating. Commissioner missing. Roberts calling emergency meeting of Supreme Court. This is just the beginning. Montgomery closed the laptop, contemplating the chaos they had unleashed. Justice might finally be possible, but the path forward would be dangerous. Blake had been merely a symptom of the disease infecting Charleston. Now they were attacking the disease itself, and it would not succumb easily. As if confirming her thoughts, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "You've made powerful enemies today. Sleep well, Judge. It may be your last chance." Montgomery deleted the message without a trace of fear. They had moved beyond threats now. The final battle was approaching, and she was ready. The Charleston County Courthouse had never witnessed anything like the scene that unfolded over the following weeks. Blake's trial had transformed from a simple assault case into a public referendum on systemic corruption. Judge Fleming compromised, but now under intense scrutiny, had no choice but to recuse himself. The South Carolina Supreme Court, in an emergency session, appointed Judge Diana Martinez from Columbia to take over a jurist with a reputation for impartiality and ethical conduct. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity each day. Overflow rooms with video feeds were established throughout the courthouse. Outside the plaza had become a permanent site of demonstrations, with people holding signs bearing Montgomery's image and slogans like, "Justice cannot be silenced," and "End police corruption." Blake, now abandoned by his powerful protectors, watched his case disintegrate as more officers came forward with testimony. The blue wall of silence had cracked under the pressure of federal investigations and public outrage. 4 members of the enforcers had accepted plea deals in exchange for testimony against their leaders. Whitfield, sensing the changing winds, had withdrawn as Blake's attorney citing irreconcilable differences with the client. Blake's court-appointed replacement lacked both Whitfield's connections and his courtroom swagger. On the trial's 5th day, Reynolds provided the most devastating testimony yet. He described in detail how the enforcers had operated within the department for over a decade, targeting black neighborhoods for aggressive policing while protecting certain drug dealers who paid for protection. He explained how seized drugs and money regularly disappeared from evidence only to reappear on the streets or in officers' offshore accounts. Most critically, he connected these activities to Garrison's real estate empire. The pattern was always the same, Reynolds testified. Blake and the others would flood a neighborhood with arrests focusing on property owners and local businesses. Property values would plummet. Then Garrison's company would buy everything at 15-20 cents on the dollar. 6 months later, those same neighborhoods would be declared revitalized with new boutiques and condos selling for 5 times what Garrison paid. As Reynolds spoke, FBI agents were executing search warrants at Garrison Development Group offices and the homes of judges, prosecutors, and city officials connected to the conspiracy. Evidence that had been buried for years was being uncovered, corroborating Reynolds' testimony and expanding the scope of the investigation. The commissioner of police remained missing, last seen boarding a private plane to an unknown destination. Chief Justice Roberts had suffered a convenient health crisis and taken an indefinite leave of absence. Mayor Davis, initially supportive of Montgomery, now maintained a careful distance, claiming the need for impartiality while investigations proceed. Behind the scenes, Montgomery's team continued gathering evidence and coordinating with federal authorities. Williams had been formally reinstated to internal affairs with expanded authority to investigate corruption. Jenkins had accepted a position with a national news organization, giving her the platform to report on the case without local interference. Calvin maintained security operations protecting witnesses and evidence from increasingly desperate attempts at intimidation. Montgomery herself had become both a symbol and a target. Death threats arrived daily. Her temporary residence changed weekly. Armed security accompanied her everywhere. Yet she appeared in court each day composed and determined, her presence a constant reminder of how the case had begun and what was at stake. On the trial's 7th day, a bombshell Blake, seeing the inevitable outcome and hoping to avoid maximum sentencing, offered to cooperate fully with prosecutors. In exchange for reducing charges from federal racketeering to lesser offenses, he would provide detailed testimony about the entire conspiracy, including names, dates, and records he had maintained as insurance. Judge Martinez cleared the courtroom for an emergency hearing to consider the deal. Inside, Blake revealed the full extent of the corruption, how Chief Justice Roberts and Garrison had directed the operation for 15 years, how they controlled judge assignments, prosecutor appointments, and police promotions, how they had arranged for critics to be silenced through intimidation, false charges, or orchestrated scandals. The assault on Judge Montgomery wasn't my idea, Blake admitted. She had been asking questions about inconsistencies in cases connected to Garrison properties. Reynolds is right. I was told to send a message that would discredit her if she kept investigating. They wanted her scared and publicly humiliated. I just took it further than planned. The plea deal was accepted, and by nightfall, federal agents had arrested 15 high-ranking officials across multiple agencies. The news broke nationally, with Charleston suddenly portrayed as an epicenter of corruption rather than a charming tourist destination. The following morning, the Judicial Review Board unanimously reinstated Montgomery to her position, acknowledging that her temporary removal had been influenced by the very corruption she had sought to expose. At a press conference on the courthouse steps, Montgomery addressed the public for the first time since the assault. This case was never about one officer's actions toward one judge. She stated, her voice steady, despite the emotions visible in her eyes. It was about a system that has protected the powerful at the expense of justice for too long. The people of Charleston, particularly those in black communities who have borne the brunt of this corruption, deserve better from their institutions and their leaders. As Montgomery stepped away from the microphones, a reporter called out, "Judge Montgomery, do you feel vindicated?" She paused, considering the question. Justice isn't about vindication. It's about truth and accountability. This is just the beginning of that process. That evening, as Montgomery reviewed case files in her newly restored chambers, there was a knock at her door. To her surprise, Police Commissioner Shaw stood in the doorway, flanked by FBI agents. He had been apprehended attempting to cross into Canada. 2 minutes, Torres said, nodding to Montgomery. Then he's headed to federal detention. Shaw, his arrogance replaced by desperation, sat heavily in the chair across from Montgomery's desk. "You have no idea what you've done," he said. "The people behind Garrison, behind all of this, they don't forget and they don't forgive." Montgomery studied him. "Who are these people, Commissioner? Because we're coming for them next." Shaw laughed bitterly. "You think this stops with Charleston? With South Carolina? This is happening in cities across the country. Different names, same system." He leaned forward. "I'll make you a deal, better than Blake got. I have names, account numbers, documents that would blow this wide open nationally. But I need witness protection immunity from prosecution." Montgomery's expression remained neutral. "That's not my decision to make, Commissioner, but I'll convey your offer to the appropriate authorities." As Torres led Shaw away, Montgomery pondered his words. If what he suggested was true, the conspiracy extended far beyond Charleston, linking corrupt systems across multiple jurisdictions. The implications were staggering, but also oddly hopeful. If such widespread corruption could be exposed and confronted in one city, perhaps it could be challenged everywhere. With renewed determination, Montgomery returned to her work. The battle for Charleston had been largely won, but as Shaw had inadvertently revealed, a much larger war awaited. Whatever came next, she would face it with the same courage and conviction that had brought her through the darkest days of her life. Justice demanded nothing less. 6 months after Blake's hand struck her face in Courtroom A, Judge Elise Montgomery sat at the center of a different kind of legal proceeding. The Charleston Commission on Police and Judicial Reform, created by emergency legislation and chaired by Montgomery herself, had been granted extraordinary powers to investigate and recommend structural changes to the city's justice system. The commission hearings, televised nationally, had become a model for similar efforts in other cities. Today's witness was Officer Ryan Blake, dressed in an orange jumpsuit, his confidence replaced by the hollow-eyed resignation of a man serving the first months of a 15-year sentence. After accepting his plea deal, Blake had become a valuable, if reluctant, asset, confirming details of the conspiracy and identifying participants who might otherwise have escaped scrutiny. Officer Blake. Montgomery began, her voice carrying the formal authority of her position. Please describe for the Commission the process by which judge assignments were manipulated in cases involving Garrison Development Group. Blake leaned toward the microphone. Court Administrator Phillips maintained a coded list of judges categorized as friendly, neutral, or problematic. Cases involving Garrison properties or associates were flagged with special designation in the filing system. Phillips would manually override the random assignment algorithm to ensure those cases went to friendly judges. And who determined which judges fell into which category? Chief Justice Roberts made those determinations based on each judge's history of rulings and their susceptibility to various forms of influence, from campaign contributions to blackmail. The testimony continued for hours, laying bare a system of corruption that had operated efficiently for nearly 2 decades. By day's end, the Commission had gathered enough evidence to recommend criminal investigations of 5 additional judges and 7 prosecutors previously thought uninvolved. The hearings represented just one aspect of Charleston's transformation. The police department had undergone radical restructuring, with 1/3 of senior officers removed and replaced. A new civilian oversight committee had been established with real disciplinary authority, not merely advisory capacity. Montgomery's daughter, Zora, fully recovered from her injuries, had been appointed to this committee, bringing her activist perspective to the formal oversight process. Detective Shanice Williams now headed a completely reconstituted Internal Affairs Division with expanded powers and independent funding. Taylor Jenkins had won the Pulitzer Prize for her reporting on the case, bringing national attention to the structural inequities that had allowed such corruption to flourish. Perhaps most significant was the federal investigation sparked by Commissioner Shaw's cooperation. What began in Charleston had expanded to include similar patterns of corruption in Atlanta, Memphis, and New Orleans, suggesting a coordinated network of criminal governance across the Southeast. Montgomery's phone rang as she reviewed applications for the newly created position of Ethics Compliance Officer. It was a representative from the White House inquiring about her interest in a federal judicial appointment. The administration was creating a special task force to address systemic corruption in local justice systems nationwide, and they wanted Montgomery to lead it. She promised to consider the offer, though it would mean leaving Charleston just as reforms were taking root. That evening, as Montgomery prepared for a rare dinner at home rather than working late, Jenkins called with disturbing news. Documents recovered from Garrison's offshore accounts implicated several officials previously thought to be allies in the reform effort, including Mayor Davis. "She's been playing both sides," Jenkins explained, "supporting you publicly while taking Garrison's money privately. The payments continued even after the investigation became public." Montgomery sighed, setting aside the pasta she'd been about to serve. Another crisis, another difficult decision. Exposing Davis would undermine public confidence in the reform process, potentially jeopardizing important institutional changes. Remaining silent would compromise the very principles of transparency and accountability she had fought to establish. After dinner, Montgomery sat on her porch reflecting on the personal cost of the past 6 months. Her home had been vandalized 3 times. She still received death threats regularly. Several longtime friends had distanced themselves uncomfortable with her crusading public image or implicated in the widening investigation. Yet there had been unexpected blessings too. Her relationship with Zora had deepened through their shared commitment to reform. She had formed genuine friendships with Williams Jenkins and Torres Bonds, forged in the crucible of danger and purpose. And throughout Charleston, particularly in historically black neighborhoods, she couldn't visit a grocery store or restaurant without people approaching to express gratitude and support. 2 weeks later, Montgomery delivered the keynote address at the National Bar Association's annual conference, speaking to thousands of black attorneys, judges, and law students. The rule of law cannot exist alongside systemic racism, she told them. They are fundamentally incompatible. One will eventually destroy the other. Our task as guardians of justice is to ensure that racism is what perishes, not the law. The speech received a standing ovation and established Montgomery as a leading voice in the national conversation on justice reform. Afterward, she announced the establishment of the Freeman Scholarship Fund, named for her former mentor, who had died under suspicious circumstances. The fund would support black law students committed to careers in public service law. As the reforms in Charleston progressed, Montgomery received an unexpected request for a meeting from former officer Samuel Daniels, once a member of the Enforcers, who had cooperated early in the investigation. Since providing evidence against his former colleagues, Daniels had completed an intensive restorative justice program and now worked with at-risk youth in the same neighborhoods he had once terrorized. "I was wrong, Judge Awe," Daniels told her during their meeting in her chambers. "Not just about the corruption, but about everything. The way I saw the community, the people I was supposed to protect. I believed all the stereotypes, all the lies we told ourselves to justify what we were doing." Montgomery studied him carefully. "What changed? Facing the truth about myself, hearing the stories of the people I hurt." Daniels hesitated. "I have information that wasn't in my original testimony. Something Blake told me that I didn't understand the significance of until recently." He explained that Blake had once mentioned insurance files hidden with someone called the librarian in Virginia. Blake said if anything ever happened to him, the librarian would release everything and it would bring down people way beyond Charleston, names that would shock everyone. With this new lead, Montgomery arranged for Torres to investigate. 3 weeks later, the FBI located the librarian, a retired intelligence officer living in rural Virginia, who had been Blake's handler during a brief stint in military police. The files proved to be even more significant than anticipated, containing evidence linking the Charleston conspiracy to similar operations in 12 other cities, all ultimately connecting to a national network of political fixers, corrupt judges, and investment firms specializing in urban revitalization. On the day this evidence became public, Montgomery received a request from the Federal Detention Center. Blake wanted to meet. Security was extraordinary as Montgomery entered the visitation room. Blake, thinner now and with the pallor of a man unused to sunlight, sat across from her at a scarred metal table. "Thank you for coming," he began, his voice lacking its former arrogance. "I'm surprised you agreed to see me." Montgomery nodded. "What do you want, Mr. Blake?" "To explain something that's been bothering me about that day in your courtroom." He leaned forward. "It wasn't just about intimidating you. It was a test." "A test? Of how the system would respond. Would it protect a white officer over a black judge? How far would that protection extend? The people running things, they wanted to know the limits of their control." Montgomery considered this. And what did they learn? That there are no limits as long as no one fights back. You weren't supposed to fight back. No one does, usually. His expression changed, a glimpse of his old self emerging. "But they miscalculated with you. And now they're vulnerable for the first time in decades." As Montgomery left the detention center, her phone buzzed with a text from Torres. "White House meeting confirmed for Thursday. Bring everything we have on Virginia Connection. This goes higher than we thought. Federal judges, 2 senators implicated." The message confirmed what Blake had suggested. The conspiracy extended to the highest levels of power, involving figures who had shaped national policy for a generation. The challenge ahead would dwarf what they had faced in Charleston. Yet, as Montgomery looked back at the prison building where Blake would spend the next 15 years, she felt something unexpected hope. Systems of oppression, no matter how entrenched, were ultimately human creations. What humans had built humans could dismantle and rebuild. The path forward would be dangerous. Powerful interests would fight to maintain their privilege. There would be setbacks and betrayals. But Montgomery was no longer fighting alone. Across the country, others like her were standing up, refusing to be silenced, demanding accountability. Together, they formed a growing movement that no conspiracy, however vast, could ultimately resist. That evening, as Montgomery prepared for the Washington trip, she received one final piece of news. Mayor Davis had resigned, citing personal reasons, but clearly anticipating the imminent exposure of her corruption. The interim Mayor-City Council President Marcus Jefferson had already reached out to express full support for the Reform Commission's work. It was a small victory in what would be a long campaign, but it mattered. Change was possible. Justice, though long delayed, could still be served. As she packed her briefcase with the files that would rock the nation's capital, Montgomery thought of all the people who had fought alongside her, risked everything for the truth. She thought of young Jamal Washington, whose unjust arrest had set everything in motion. She thought of her father, who had bled for justice decades earlier. She thought of Judge Wilson, who had lived with the shame of silence and warned her not to make the same mistake. They were all part of the same long struggle, a struggle that would continue long after her own contribution ended. But today, in this moment, the arc of history had bent however slightly toward justice. And that was enough reason to continue the fight tomorrow and all the tomorrows that followed. What do you think needs to change in our justice system to ensure equal treatment for all citizens? Leave a comment below with your thoughts on how we can build a more just society. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to hear more powerful stories of people standing up against discrimination and corruption. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the darkest corners of our system and the courageous people fighting to bring light. Remember, change begins when we refuse to accept injustice as normal. The gavel's echo teaches us that justice requires courage in the face of entrenched power. When Judge Montgomery faced that racist assault, she could have accepted the path of least resistance, allowing the system to minimize the incident and continue unchanged. Instead, she chose the harder path of confronting not just one officer's actions, but an entire corrupt system built on racial inequality. Her story reminds us that meaningful change rarely comes easily. It demands persistence against intimidation, betrayal, and danger. It shows us the importance of allies from family members to reformed insiders who provide crucial support when fighting powerful interests. Most importantly, it demonstrates how racism and corruption thrive in darkness, but wither under scrutiny. By refusing to be silenced, Montgomery transformed her personal assault into a catalyst for systemic change. The story challenges us to examine our own choices when witnessing injustice. Do we stay silent for comfort and safety, or speak truth to power? It reminds us that while corrupt systems appear overwhelming, they are ultimately human creations that can be dismantled through collective action and unwavering commitment to truth. No matter how deeply entrenched injustice may be, the human spirit's capacity for courage and solidarity can ultimately triumph. What would you do if you witnessed corruption or racism in your community? Would you have the courage to stand up like Judge Montgomery, even at great personal risk? Leave a comment below, sharing a time when you or someone you know took a stand against injustice. If you believe our justice system needs reform to truly serve all citizens equally, hit that like button to show your support. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories of everyday heroes fighting against discrimination and systemic racism. Share this video with someone who needs to understand the ongoing struggle for equality in our institutions. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Judge Montgomery's fight for justice. Remember, change begins with individuals brave enough to say enough in the face of wrongdoing. Together, we can build a more just world where no one is above the law and everyone is treated with dignity regardless of their race.